Hey everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Today, I'm taking a look at the newest entry to Neural DSP's Archetype line of plugins, Nolly. Nolly's name has become practically synonymous with contemporary metal production between his involvement with Periphery, even more recent Devin Townsend work, and of course spearheading Get Good Drums. The man went from basically unknown to a titan of modern metal over the course of about a decade. So the guy's got some talent. I think that doesn't really need to be expanded upon, but he continues to impress with his involvement with Neural DSP's new plugin, Archetype Nolly. This release somewhat closely follows the initial entry into the Archetype plugin series with Plenty, and as such, I'm going to be making a lot of direct comparisons between the two because this very much follows a similar format from the NTS to the Fortin Nameless release where a lot of similar ground is being covered here, and it's hard to recommend someone buy both at the same time. So we're very much in a similar situation where either the older plugin is going to be obsolete for some prospective new buyers, or older buyers of that plugin may be feeling a little salty that some new features were introduced into this one, but we'll save that towards the end of the video. And for now, let's jump into Archetype Nolly. As basically everyone has echoed at this point, if you're familiar at all with a Neural DSP plugin, you're going to feel right at home here. It's the same navigation, same input-output level controls. You got a gate, mono stereo switch, high oversampling switch, as well as a healthy selection of factory and artist presets, with Nolly providing the most varied among them all. And they're all really good kind of bedrocks to start building your tone from. Generally, I'm a build a tone from scratch kind of guy, and of course that's how you're going to get the most varied and interesting sounds out of here, in my opinion. But as far as exploring what this has to offer, go through Nolly's presets. They're labeled well, and they all sound really, really cool, which I would hope so. This is, after all, modeled after all of his gear. So with that, let's talk about some of the gear that is modeled in this plugin. Starting off the signal chain, we have a dummy-proof compressor, which has a single compression control, which presumably controls either your ratio or threshold, an output level setting, and an attack time switch between snappy and smooth. This one's kind of hard to get a bad sound out of, which is nice. I don't really like tweaking compressors all that much anyway, and you could presumably dial back the compression and just turn up the level if you want a clean boost, say for a solo or driving the front end of one of these amplifiers a bit harder. So good inclusion there. Not exactly, again, kind of treading new ground here with the same sort of compression technique on Plenty, but let's move on to the overdrive, which is your TS9 808 style overdrive. This one basically sounds more or less like a run-of-the-mill tube screamer as far as I can tell. The Fortin NTS and Plenty kind of had a little bit of a different flavor in terms of how harsh the attack was or the gain structure, but this one more or less sounds exactly like my Tube Screamer Mini, so it's good because it behaves the same way. Then we have a delay in the pre-section, which is something you rarely ever see in plugins, period, but especially not on one that is more focused on heavier genres. Whether you're into country slapback delay or more washed out ambient type tones that are included in Nolly's own presets, this delay can get you there. So you've got feedback, mix, time, and a tone control for what I think is like a high pass or a low pass rather, and then you can sync it with tempo, just like with the other delays present in Neural DSP's plugins. Then that brings us to Overdrive 2, and this is a very powerful overdrive pedal in the sense that it kind of sounds like an amp channel in a box. Has a MOSFET type distortion quality to my ears, perhaps even early op-amp type designs. Either way, you have a volume gain and a treble and bass control instead of your standard single tone control. This is good either driving some of the lower gain amplifiers if you want to turn up the gain, or you can turn gain to practically minimum, turn up the volume, roll back the bass, and now you have kind of your traditional roll-off boost thing for metal amplifiers. So this pairs actually really well with all of them. You can, again, kind of use this as your dirt pedal for the cleaner amps, or I prefer to use it as kind of a substitute for a graphic EQ, at least how I would use one. So that brings us to what are usually the stars of the show for Neural DSP plugins with the amplifier collection. Fortunately, I don't have to play the guessing game this time around thanks to the guitar playing community and actually the YouTube comment section. I guess hell is officially frozen over at this point, but these have all been more or less confirmed, so I can tell you exactly what they're modeled after. We have 4 amp channels to choose from, breaking the previous record of 3 held by the Plenty plugin, starting with the clean channel, which is a Bogner Shiva. This is an exciting inclusion for me because I really like that amp. I don't remember a whole lot of either hardware or software modeling this, sans like the HD 500 from Pod and Fractal Axe Effects. So it's cool to see this in a plugin. It's a really great clean channel. And if you have single coil pickups, especially in kind of a more vintage output level, it's really hard to get this thing to break up at all. You might get a little bit of edge on your pick attack on a bridge pickup, but say a Telecaster neck, this thing is going to sound smooth and lovely compression, especially if you turn up the gain and master volume. But if you hit this with, say, a 61 spec humbucker, especially on the neck position, you can get some flubby, woofy kind of tones that I really like. It reminds me of cranking, say, a Fender Tweed or even a Mesa Boogie Mark I. Really cool tones. This is a great addition. I know this is one of Nolly's favorite clean amps, so I'm glad they chose this one. The next amplifier provides your British crunch palette of tones, and this is based on some sort of modified Marshall Super Lead, whether that's a JCM 800 or a JMP 2203, kind of hard to tell from the promotional pictures, but leaning towards the JCM side of things. And more specifically, this isn't your Fortin style of modified Marshalls. This doesn't really cross paths with the Fortin Nameless much. This isn't your clingy metal machine. This really has the gain range of edge of breakup, almost clean plexi tones to slightly overdriven JCM 800. So it's more of a good pedal platform or something you should use for mid-gain sounds. Though if you use one of those overdrive pedals, you can definitely push it over the edge, make it great for rhythm and especially articulate leads. So a great inclusion here. Has the same controls as the last amp with the bright switch standard tone stack, in addition to presence and a depth circuit, which is something you don't see on standard Marshalls. Moving on to the third amplifier. This one shouldn't be too hard to guess based on the palette of colors used alone. This is a modified PV6505. This is your 5150 type sound. This is a particularly great sounding 5150. It has that perfect amount of articulation and yet gain saturation in the noon to 7 region, depending on your guitar. And I mean, it's 5150. Do I really have to go any further? It's the rhythm machine, great for leads, plays well with all the pedals. Yeah, it's awesome. And our final amplifier entry is a lunchbox style lead amp, which is purportedly the Victory Kraken, which is really cool because I don't think I've ever seen this modeled in any software or hardware I've ever used. So nice to see it get some love here. This is kind of like this beautiful mismatch of all parts high watt, Marshall, orange, and a little bit of its own stuff going on. As you turn the gain down, you get kind of a little bit of over-the-top edge of breakup, some really cool ambient crunch tones to be had here. And then the further you go, it's like this squishy, saturated, almost overdriven wizard or Splawn type sound. And this works awesome for leads, but you can get some really cool saturated rhythm tones as well. I really prefer to use this with pedals because of that, but you can get some great sounds without it as well. I also saw in some of the promotional pictures they were tinkering with a diesel VH4 at some point, so a little disappointed we didn't see either channel 3 or channel 4 into here, but 4 amp channels is already a really great palette of tones to choose from, and again, leads the pack in terms of versatility in Neural DSP's plugins. After the amp section, we have an in-the-loop graphic EQ, and this is a 9-band GEQ, which is basically the same as a 10-band minus the 32 Hertz control. And I've always loved seeing these in the Archetype plugins because I'm a maniac when it comes to graphic EQ in the loop. I would love to see this added in the Fortin, Nameless, and NTS plugins as well, so fingers crossed for that. It sounds good, works exactly how you would expect, so not a whole lot to go over there. Next up, we have the extremely impressive cabinet section, which encompasses over 600 different impulse responses to make up this mic'd speaker collection. So we have 4 independent cabinets as well as a collection of 4 microphones to mix and match. There is one feature I would have liked to seen here that's not there, but we'll get to that in a moment, and they could potentially patch this in, though I don't necessarily see them doing so. So we have a matching cabinet for each amplifier, and in linked mode, as you'll see, when I change the cab, it changes the amp head. However, if you go to unlinked, you can actually use whatever cabinet and amplifier head combination you want, which already makes this thing just a behemoth in terms of tonal options and flexibility. So starting with the clean cab, and again, when I say clean cab, this is just the one that's matched by default. We have a 4x12 with 25 watt speakers, which they've got to be greenbacks. Next up, we have the Crunch cab, which is some sort of Marshall cabinet with T75 speakers, the only 75 watt greenbacks that come to mind. Then we have an American 4x12, which I again presume is a standard size Mesa Boogie with V30s. And then finally, this one was confirmed to be a Zilla cab with V30. So a little bit of overlap there with the vintage 30s, but very different cabinets, very different sounds. So this basically covers like all the tones I would ever want. In fact, the 2 most used cabinets in my collection feature V30s and T75s, and you might have noticed I like to blend those in impulse response form on the channel all the time. And then the greenbacks kind of cover everything else on the cleaner side of things or more vintage tone. So like nailed it as far as I'm concerned with the speaker choice. Something like Jesus speakers would have been cool with Demon speakers, but regardless, this is pretty much what Nolly uses. In addition to the dynamic microphone choices, you got 1 condenser, 1 ribbon as well. So nothing greatly out of the ordinary, but all industry standard microphones. Now, the thing I would have liked to have been able to do is to blend these cabinets. So say on the PV5150 or 6505 type sound, I would have liked to have been able to blend this V30 with the T75. So say split it down the middle, 1 microphone, 1 cab kind of style. Perhaps that's something that Nolly usually doesn't do, and so it's thematically correct that you can't do that. But either way, a minor thing, you can always double up on the instances of this plugin and do it manually, or even just, input another impulse response over here of another of your favorite cabinet and call it a day. So not a huge deal, but just a minor loss in some of the flexibility they could have had. Either way, it still eradicates their past plugins in terms of tonal flexibility. Finally, we have the post effects section featuring the same flavors of echo effects you'd see on the previous Archetype release with Delay 2, that's Delay 1's in the pre-section, and a reverb pedal. Delay 2 has the same sort of modulation effects you can dial in independently, a ping pong switch, tap tempo, feedback, mix time, all the stuff you'd expect on a delay pedal, and high and low cut controls to control how full frequency or not the delays sit in the mix, so you can make it sound a little more warm and vintage like a tape or analog delay, or full frequency like a digital delay. And the reverb pedal is very much static. You can't really change the overall sound of it. It's kind of like a washed out hall type thing. It sounds good, but if you're expecting to get like a garage band thrash metal in the room type thing, this isn't going to do it. You also have the same low high cut switches, a decay time, and overall mix. So this very much represents the kind of delay and reverb tones that Nolly dials in using plugins or outboard gear. So just expect that going in. Either way, though, the delay is extremely versatile, and the reverb always sounds good. It's just a very specific flavor of it. So you might have to pair this with other plugins or outboard gear if you're looking for a different kind of tone. Either way, let's take a look at some of the other sounds that are available in this plugin. I'm going to be mixing and matching cabinets, different effects. You'll hear a couple different snippets for each amplifier. And again, for most of this, I actually use the presets, mostly provided by Nolly, and then tweak them to my taste. Before I can end this video, I have to discuss the elephant in the room, and that is Archetype Plenty, the previously released Archetype plugin. And this is a similar situation as I alluded to earlier with the Fortin plugins, where nowadays the Nameless and the NTS, now that Nameless has been patched, are basically the same plugin minus the amp section. So it's kind of a weird thing where at this point it almost makes sense to just provide them in the same launcher or be able to use them in the same plugin and switch amp heads like you can in here. But at the time it made sense, and even the value proposition today is still very high because, you know, you're looking at two discontinued amplifiers that are north of $3,000, if not $5,000 for the Natos, or even, you know, a couple grand for the Randall Satan, which is the closest thing to it. So even then, two separate plugins, $100 a piece, it's still not a bad value. With this though, this is so directly comparable to the Plenty plugin, it hurts. And in every objective way that you can quantify this, the Nolly plugin absolutely eradicates the Plenty plugin. Tired of saying plugin, but I have to. In terms of actual value, if you're looking at features per dollar, because they cost the same at 135 euros, or is it dollars? One of those price points. You'll see it here. Either way, if you go line by line, starting with the pre-effects section, the Plenty plugin has a compressor and an overdrive. We've seen that here, except you actually have a couple more controls on the compressor on Nolly, as well as two extra pedals, like the delay and what I consider to be a very valuable amp in the box kind of overdrive. So score 1 for Nolly. You have the same post EQ after the amp section. Again, kind of a wash there. The time-based effects are damn near identical in terms of control. The only difference is the Plenty version has a tape saturation control if you want it to be more, you know, tapey. And then the reverb has a space option, making it a bit more versatile in terms of the tones you can get out of it, but it's a very similar sort of washed out thing. So in my opinion, unless you're going for this very specific kind of prog rock kind of reverb or delay, the one in Nolly is going to do just fine. The amp section is where things start to get really interesting, because not only are the amps that are there in Plenty directly comparable to the new ones in Nolly, but the new plugin also has an extra model on top of that. So the Plenty Clean amp is kind of your Fender type American Clean tone affair. I'm not exactly sure what it's based on, but I mean, the Shiva kind of covers that ground and goes a little further, in my opinion. This thing was really hard to get to break up whatsoever. But you push it hard enough, you can. Either way, all down to preferences at that point. I like them both. The Crunch amp is yet again kind of that modded Marshall type of thing. I'm not sure exactly what it's based on. I could get almost an identical sound out of the Carvin Legacy models on the Fractal AX8. So I imagine it's in that region, or Friedman Brown Eye type of tone. Either way, there's a modded Marshall in both. Then we have the lead amp on Plenty, which sounds like a 5153 PRS Archon. Again, almost identical ground cover to the PV6505 model on the new plugin. It does have a bit more of a Soldano early Mesa Boogie rectifier kind of thing going on the Plenty plugin. Either way, I would take either, if I was plugin shopping. So really treading the same sort of ground. It's just at this point, these are Nolly's actual amps versus Plenty's idealized models. And then, of course, you got the Kraken on top of all of that, which, again, covers a little bit of the ground that maybe the 5150 doesn't. So, once again, got to chalk up that victory to Nolly just based on the amount of tones available. And frankly, I kind of like the Marshall model better on the Nolly than I do the crunch tone here. And the knockout punch comes in the form of the cabinet simulation, which Nolly absolutely eradicates everything that Neural DSP has done in the past in terms of tonal flexibility. Sound quality is so great on the other plugins, don't get me wrong, but here you're limited to what is presumed to be a vintage 30 loaded Marshall style cabinet, whereas you have so many options with the new one. So if I'm a new customer and I'm looking on their website and I'm comparing the two plugins, it's a no-brainer. Nolly all day long, because for the same amount of money, you're getting 3 more cabinets, so many more pedals, another amplifier channel. And this is one of those markets where I feel like people like the tones that are here, but they're not necessarily trying to sound exactly like the people who are behind these plugins. I'm not buying the Fortin Nameless to sound exactly like Meshuggah, not buying the Fortin NTS to sound exactly like Ola England. And so I have to assume that even though these are signature products, there might be some people out there that, are trying to cover one of their songs and they're going to use that. That's cool. But I have to think that at least most of the people out there are trying to craft their own tones. So for the same amount of money, wouldn't you go for the one that provides more tonal options that maybe at this point sounds a little commercial, maybe a little mainstream on the Nolly side of things, but it's because the tones are so good because they've been used all that often. Personally, I would not even consider the Plenty plugin at the price that it's at. And that brings up a whole other problem with pricing. And this is something that, without knowing their R&D costs or seeing their actual accounting data, I can't say what's fair from their point of view. But from a consumer point of view, if I'm going to look at what I get for the same amount of money, I'm going to go for the one that is the better value. It's simple as that. And Nolly, it just knocks it out of the park. I mean, for the cab section alone, you'd probably spend more in impulse responses to get that many tones than you would just the plugin alone. So even if you want to use the cab section, get Nolly, even without a discount. And with a discount, it's a no-brainer. The only argument that could be made is there's very specific features that the Plenty plugin has that, perhaps you may want, but it does not justify the cost difference for me. And then you look at other things like their older plugins, which I'm sure cost more in development since they were still kind of tweaking their process. But you got stuff like Parallax Bass that for $100, it's not impressive compared to what you just spit out here. So I'm sure they did some predictions on volume and exactly how many copies they would sell. But still, I would be much more willing to buy the Nolly plugin for $135 compared to Parallax for $100, or even Nameless and NTS at $100. So maybe there's some opportunities to look at pricing, but I kind of think it's too late because a lot of people have already paid for it. So it's weird. And as this keeps going on and more of these signature Archetype plugins come out, I'm sure this is going to be a continuing problem But it's, again, kind of the same problem they had with NTS, where they're their own competition. All this stuff is super high quality, but I'm also getting a little weary of seeing so many Neural DSP plugins in my plugin chain, and I would just kind of like to be able to use it in one launcher. So hopefully that would come at some point. But you know, at this point, I can't say that's a certainty or something that anyone should be waiting for, because it would be pretty cool to, you know, use these effects with Fortin NTS. Regardless, Nolly, it kicks ass. It's really great. The worst thing going for it is that you've heard so many of these tones so many times on Periphery albums or anything that Nolly's produced that you might feel it's a little samey. But in terms of capturing the quality that's there, and ultimately these are a little bit, you know, custom modified equipment, then I think it's a hell of a value proposition. So high recommendation for me, but it kind of nulls and voids some of my previous recommendations for their stuff. So we'll have to see what happens next time. Thanks for watching. Any other questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below. And hopefully we'll see you in another review down the road. Thanks. Bye.